Well, good evening. It is a pleasant, I wouldn't call it a surprise to be here, but the way the weather was going, a bit of a surprise that I made it. I'm from the Huntsville area, so I was planning to leave in time to grab a bite to eat once I got here. That didn't work out so good. I had to wait until everything passed by, but things worked out pretty good. Only ran into one tree that was down, but it was pulled off to the side by the time I got there, so it was really quite uneventful. But it is a pleasure to be here, pleasure to be able to talk to you about particularly this minor prophet, Habakkuk. If you have your Bibles, you might open them to the book of Habakkuk. We're going to spend our time looking at the message that he has for us here, and hopefully it will be an encouragement to us. I believe that it will be. Imagine for just a moment if you were perhaps a soldier or a landowner traveling with George Washington before the Revolutionary War. Or maybe you were with Abraham Lincoln before the war between the states. You were looking at your future and you knew there's a very good chance it's going to get really, really bad. There's going to be bloodshed, there's going to be terror, there's going to be hunger, there are going to be some horrible things happen, and there's a lot of uncertainty because you don't really know how things are going to turn out. Well, to face trials like that are, depending on the scale, are things that all of us face, and was certainly something that Habakkuk faced. We may not know, I don't know how much you know about the background of Habakkuk, but I would imagine that you know the key verse within the book of Habakkuk, which is, "The just shall live by faith." It is quoted 3 times in the New Testament and significantly quoted in the New Testament, because this is a principle of life for the children of God from the beginning of time until the return of the Lord. And what I would like for us to do in our lesson is to look at this statement in the context of the historical background of Habakkuk, what he was going through, and see the parallels that it has for us in our day and time as well. So we begin with a little bit of where he falls in history. You can see that Habakkuk was one of the minor prophets. Israel and Judah had been divided because of the sin of Solomon, and Israel to the north is going to be destroyed by the Assyrians in 722, but the southern tribes of Judah, they have a little bit more longevity. They have some good kings intermixed in their history, and so they are doing better than Israel, but by the time of Habakkuk, they are not doing well at all morally. They have declined in their immorality and in their idolatry and in their injustice, to the point that Habakkuk looks up to God and speaks to him. So Habakkuk is a little bit different among the minor prophets, because a prophet is someone who brings the message of God to the people. And usually one of the prophets begins with, "The word of the Lord came to such and such a prophet during the time of such and such a king," and he speaks to the people. This one is Habakkuk begins by speaking to God. God gives him the privilege to ask him some questions. And in fact, it seems maybe the first question in particular, if not the second question, maybe even a little bit sarcastic, maybe questioning the character of God a little bit. But he allows him to get away with it, because God is going to use this as a means to teach some very valuable lessons. And so we will be looking at the just shall live by faith. The mountains in the life of Habakkuk. So we begin here in chapter 1, where Habakkuk asks questions of God. Chapter 1 and verse 2. "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless. Justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds. Habakkuk is totally frustrated in Israel, in Judah, in Jerusalem in particular. And he's frustrated because of the iniquity, the sin, the immorality that he sees all around him. And in particular, he's frustrated with God. Because it seems that he's asking, why aren't you doing something about this? Look at the life of the righteous in the midst of your people. In the midst of your people, there is no justice. In the midst of your people, there is immorality. We, your people, are suffering down here, and what are you doing about it? Well, God answers him in chapter 1, beginning with verse 5. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days, which you would not believe, though it were told you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. And he goes on and describes the tactics they used in war, which were brutal tactics. So God's answer to, why aren't you doing anything, is, hey, I'm doing a lot. I am bringing judgment upon the wicked in Judah. I am raising up this nation. They don't know that they're doing my will, but through my providence, I am bringing this nation, these Chaldeans, and they're going to come and they're going to destroy the wicked among you. Well, Habakkuk has a second question, verse 12. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours one more righteous than he? And he continues on there. He is questioning the actions of God. He is saying, this isn't just. Okay, we're an unjust nation. Okay, there's a lot of immorality and there's a lot of idolatry in Judah right now. But you're talking about the Chaldeans. This is an arrogant, this is a pride-filled group of individuals. You're going to send this nation against us? They're more wicked than we are. It doesn't make any sense to me. I just don't understand. So God is going to answer him. Chapter 2 and verse 1, Habakkuk says, I will stand to my watch, I will set myself on the rampart, and watch to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer when I am reproved. He's really pretty high on his own pride here. I'm just going to wait for God to answer my questions, and then I'll respond to him in return. Well, in verse 5, God responds, indeed, because he transgresses, I think he's talking about the Chaldeans here, by wine. He is a proud man. He does not stay at home, because he enlarges the desires as hell. He is like death and cannot be satisfied. He gathers to himself all nations and heaps up for himself all people. Shall not all these take up a proverb against him, a taunting riddle against him, say, woe to him who increases? And he goes on, and I believe prophesies of the destruction of the Chaldeans. So God begins by saying, I am raising up the Chaldeans to destroy the wicked of Judah. Habakkuk says, you can't do that, because you cannot have a wicked nation come against one more righteous than he is. And God says, well, that's exactly what I'm doing, but don't worry. I'm going to destroy the Chaldeans because of the evil and the arrogance in fulfilling my will, in taking care of the evil in Judah. So what is Habakkuk going to say Well, actually, it's interesting how his tone changes, and we're going to get to that at the end of the lesson. But before we get to that, we skipped over verse 4, which is significant of chapter 2. Chapter 2 and verse 4. Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Habakkuk needed to learn a lesson, and that is that arrogance and pride has no place in a man's relationship with God. What a man needs to have is faith, and he needs to live by that faith. And so Habakkuk is going to have to look to the promise of God that, yes, Judah, the Chaldeans are going to be destroyed, and Judah is actually, he doesn't mention it in this prophecy, but he does in others, Judah is going to be able to be restored. They're going to be able to come back. Well, he's saying this about 610 BC. They're going to go through a series of deportations of destruction, but it's not going to be until Cyrus in 539 that's going to allow a remnant to come back after the destruction, after 70 years in captivity. Then Cyrus is going to say, I want some of you Jews to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, a small remnant to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. So here is Habakkuk standing here, and he sees that there is going to be a promise out there somewhere, probably after his death. What's he supposed to do? Because in between him and that promise are mountains of suffering. And it happened because the king, Jehoiakim, in 605, was taken by the Babylonians in bronze fetters, along with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and a lot of the riches that were in the temple. They were taken to Babylon. The defeat was beginning. He, Jehoiakim, seems to have reigned perhaps even from exile, and it wasn't until 597 that Jehoiachin was given the reins. He only reigned for 3 months, and he rebelled against the king of Babylon. And the king of Babylon came and took him away, along with 10,000 slaves. 10,000s among the people of Israel were taken away slaves, and much more of the riches that were in the temple. And there was a vassal king set up named Zedekiah. He was a servant of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And he was to keep charge over the poorest who were left behind there in Jerusalem. But he also became proud against Nebuchadnezzar, and he revolted against him. And so Nebuchadnezzar came back in 587, and there he destroyed them. Let's go to the book of 2 Kings, if you would. Just read a little bit of this destruction. 2 Kings chapter 25, to get a sense of what Habakkuk and the people who were in Judah, specifically in Jerusalem, were going to have to endure for the next several years. In chapter 25 of 2 Kings, pick up the reading here in verse 2. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. In the 9th month of the 9th day of the 4th month, a famine became so severe in the city that there was no food for the people in the land. And the city wall was broken through, and all of the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, which was at the king's garden, even though the Chaldeans were still encompassed all around against the city. And the king went up by the plain, and the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king, and they took him in the plains of Jericho. All his army was scattered from him. And they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah. And they pronounced judgment upon him. And they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him in bronze fetters, and took him to Babylon. So the last thing that the king is able to see is the killing, the murder of his sons. And then they pluck out his eyes, and they take him away into exile. The Chaldeans are so angry with the Jews at this time that they sack the entire city of Jerusalem. Usually, a city is taken over by a foreign country that has dominion over them. But the Chaldeans just destroyed and burned Jerusalem to the ground. They burned the temple. They burned the king's palace. They burned the houses. They took away all of the riches, and they just let it sit there for decades. Just sit there. God was making a point to the evil that had taken place there in Jerusalem. How bad did it get during this 18-month siege just before their destruction, just before there's a breach in the walls and the soldiers run away and the kings run away rather than protecting the city? Let's go to the book of Lamentations. Jeremiah was a prophet during this same time. And Jeremiah was able to witness just how horrible the situation became there. And he wrote a book that he calls Lamentations, that is, crying. And he describes what was happening in the city. And we'll just read one excerpt of this in chapter 4, beginning with verse 3. Even the jackals present their breasts to nurse their young, but the daughter of my people has become cruel like ostriches in the wilderness. The tongue of the infant clings to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The young children ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them. Those who eat delicacies are desolate in the streets. Those who are brought up in the scarlet embrace ash heaps. The punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, and no hand to help her. Her Nazarites were brighter than snow and whiter than milk. They were more ruddy in body than rubies, like sapphire in their appearance. Now their appearance is blacker than soot. They go unrecognized in the streets. Their skin clings to their bones. It has become as dry as wood. Those slain by the sword are better off than those who die of hunger, for these pine away, stricken for lack of the fruits of the field. The hands of the compassionate women have cooked their own children. They became food for them in the destruction of the daughter of my people. The Lord has fulfilled his fury. He has poured out his fierce anger. He has kindled a fire in Zion, and it has devoured its foundations. It's just hard to imagine. I mean, this is war that is not sanitized. There's no missiles being shot from miles away, no bombs being dropped from hundreds of yards in the air. This is hand-to-hand combat when there is combat, but what they're doing before the combat is they're just starving the people. They're just camped out around the city walls for 18 months until it gets so, it's just hard to imagine for it to get so bad that mothers are eating their own children. It's just hard to imagine. But that is what Habakkuk is looking at in the future. God has predicted the Chaldeans are coming, and you're not going to win. The people of God are not going to win. And the unrighteous, many of them are going to be killed and or taken away as captive. But you know what? So are the righteous. They're going to be caught up in all this as well. They're going to have to suffer in the midst of all of that as well. What do you do? How do you survive? How do you keep your sanity through all of that? God says, faith. He says, the just shall live by faith. You're going to have to trust God. You're going to have to trust him that what is going to happen is just, and what is going to come from that is actually going to bring about good in your life. more maturity, spiritual maturity. There are going to be blessings that are going to come from the remnant that is going to return because they are going to learn their lesson about idolatry. And ultimately, there is going to be Jesus Christ that is going to come into the world that will bring the greatest spiritual blessings in the history of mankind. But you can't get there without going through this terrible suffering. Trust me. The just shall live by faith. The just shall live by faith. This is not an academic exercise of, yes, I'll check a few boxes. Yes, I believe in God. No, you're going to have to live by faith. It's going to get tough in Jerusalem. You're going to be pressured to compromise your holiness, your convictions. You're going to be tempted to become bitter and angry and lash out. You're going to have to live by faith. He says, the just shall live by faith. You can't appeal to an atheist to live by faith. They're going to say, why should I trust God? I don't trust anybody. You know who I trust? I trust the Egyptians. Let's go make an alliance with the Egyptians. Let's go make an alliance with the Assyrians. Let's go over to Edom and Moab. Let's make an alliance with some foreign countries because, well, you can see them. You know, they'll come to our aid and they'll help us out. No, the just are the only ones that are going to trust God. So this is not only an exhortation to Habakkuk. This is a criteria to determine whether or not he is just, whether or not he is a child of God, or whether or not he needs to be destroyed because of his unfaithfulness. So, this is kind of deep and dark, but life gets kind of deep and dark sometimes. So what can we learn from this? Well, let's go to one of the New Testament passages that quotes this prophetic utterance here, to the book of Hebrews in the 10th chapter. The Hebrews were Jews who became Christians. They were individuals who were able to enjoy the greatest spiritual blessings in the history of mankind. And yet, they were under tremendous pressure to compromise their faith. And so the Hebrew writer writes them in this treatise is, why would you do that? Because what you've got is better than Judaism in so many different ways. He goes through and he enumerates how Jesus is better and how the system of Christianity is better. But in the midst of that, toward the end of the book, he is getting to the practical application. And he says here in chapter 10 and verse 38, now the just shall live by faith. But if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but those who believe to the saving of the soul. The Hebrew writer quotes Habakkuk here because these people needed to learn the lesson of Habakkuk. They also needed to look through the trials of life and continue to live by faith. If you back up just a few verses here, the Hebrew writer talks about their life, chapter 10 and verse 32. But recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. He looks back at their past, and he says, when you became Christians, your Jewish unbelieving brethren treated you with disdain. They locked you out of your ability to make a living. They made your lives miserable. They pushed you out of the family. You suffered in many, many ways. But you're only halfway there. He says in verse 35, therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith. And if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. Notice that he says here, you need endurance because after you have done the will of God, you shall receive the promise. Isn't that true for all of us? We do not receive the promise until we look through the mountains that we have to go through by faith, so that we might obtain those promises, so that we might gain that endurance, that maturity, that patience. How many people have there been? Maybe I should say it a different way. How many Christians have not had to suffer persecutions of one way or another? I think we all have had difficulties because of our stand for the truth. Sometimes there are individuals who become Christians. I'm thinking of a woman who became a Christian. And she had been taking a Bible correspondence course, and she contacted the church that had sent them to her and said, I want to become a Christian. I want to be baptized. So the preacher went out to see her and sat down with her, made sure she understood what she was saying, what she was doing, and she did. She said, I want to become a Christian. And the husband was listening in, and he said, you do that, and I won't be here when you get back. She said, I got to do this. I've got to obey the Lord. She went out. They went out to the river. She was baptized. When they got back, he wasn't there. He ended up shacking up with some woman. She kicked him out. He comes back as a drunk. She tries to help him out. But anyway, what a life. I mean, why would you take on that life? Was it because of the pleasantness of the moment? Or because she would have a relationship with Jesus Christ and her sins forgiven? Or was it because she would have brethren from all over the world who would stand with her for what was right? Was it because she would have a purpose of life, a direction in life, a hope of a home in heaven with God? How many individuals are there who have had to stand up and sometimes face the possibility or even the inevitability of losing their job because they will not compromise their convictions? How many moms are there who worry about their children when they're sending them off to school with all of the craziness that's going on as far as the gender identity problems that we have? How many college students are there that are going through the doors and they know that they are going to be confronted by teachers who are going to not just sheepishly argue against God, but boldly try to destroy their faith? We all have trials that we have to go through in life, persecutions that we have to go through in life. How do we do it? How do we make it? Just like everybody else. Just like we could read all of the ones in Hebrews 11, couldn't we? Did any of them have an easy life? Abraham and Sarah and Moses, the children of Israel? They all had mountains to go through. They all had to live by faith. Another example of someone who lived by faith was the Apostle Paul. In the book of 2 Corinthians, in the 11th chapter, the Apostle Paul makes a list of the various difficulties that he had to endure because he was standing for the truth. He was trying to preach to other individuals. He starts his list in chapter 11 and verse 23 of 2 Corinthians. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more in labors, more abundant, in stripes above measures, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of rivers, in perils of robbers. He goes through this whole list here of all of the things that he had to go through. Because he was serving the Lord, he says in verse 28, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all of the churches. So not only did he have physical things, trials that he had to go through, he also had this anxiety, concern, worry about the churches that he was dealing with and whether or not they would remain faithful. And above and beyond that, in chapter 12, God allowed Satan to give him a thorn in the flesh, which made his life miserable. And 3 times he asked God, please take this away. I mean, there are individuals who face terrible physical trials, sometimes because they are standing up for the truth, but sometimes just because life gives them cancer, or life gives them a problem with their knees, or a problem with their hips, or numerous other things that individuals have to undergo. And many times we pray for God to take it away. Does God promise to take away all of our physical ailments? Does He promise to make all of our business deals work out? Does He promise to make us as Christians the most affluent physically by the world's standards, richest people in the world? He promised to give us enough to eat and enough to put on in order to survive. And the greatest spiritual blessings in the history of the world. That's the emphasis of God. And so Jesus speaks to Paul, and he says in verse 9, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Paul says, "Therefore most gladly I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." The Apostle Paul learned not just to survive through the mountains of suffering of life. He learned to thrive in that. He learned to take pleasure in that, because when he emptied himself of what he thought was strength, he relied upon the strength of Jesus Christ. And when he did that, that's when he found real strength. Go back to what Jesus says there again in verse 9. "My grace is sufficient for you." Is it? Is it enough that Jesus Christ came to this earth and suffered the way that He did and died on the cross for our sins? Is that enough for us? Is it enough that He has given us the pattern for our life to enhance our life and to make it even better in the spiritual realm? Is that enough for us? Is it enough for us that He gives us the hope of eternal life? Is that enough? Or do we also want all of our physical ailments taken away? Do we also want all of the difficulties of life taken away? Do we also want all of the mountains of suffering that we have in this life, all of them to disappear? Do we want that too? Jesus doesn't promise that. He promises us difficulties. But He says, "My grace is sufficient for you." And when we focus on that, what a prize that is. I remember talking to a lady. She was the wife of a man who was a member of the church in North Carolina when I preached there. Strong Christian, very good man. But his wife, she had been part of a religious denomination in her past. She was not practicing anything at the time, but she was just bitter against God. So anytime I went around, or my wife went around, she was really rude to us. She did not like us being around. And she had a lot of health problems. So we tried to be nice to her. I remember going up to the hospital one time, and she just turned her back on me. Just turned her back and wouldn't speak to me. Well, it got worse, her pain, so she was going to have surgery. And the doctor said, "Well, this is so delicate in your back that you may be paralyzed and not be able to walk." So her husband called me in, said, "Jeff, would you talk to my wife before the surgery?" So I went in there, and I had no idea what to say. I can't bring up God. She's not even barely going to speak to me. I was really at a loss of what to say. Well, she went through the surgery. They cut too much. She was paralyzed, never walked again. But something happened to her. She began to change her tone. And in fact, one day she called and said, "Would you come and study the Bible with me?" So my wife, Martha, and I went over to her house and studied the Bible with her. And she was just open to the truth. And after a few studies, she said, "I want to be baptized." And we made arrangements to get her down to the baptistry, and me and 5 other guys in a stretcher got her into the baptistry and baptized her into Christ. And there was just a joy being around her. It was just the transformation was just amazing. Well, her situation turned worse, and she was not going to get any better, so I went to see her again. But this time, sorry, I'll try to get through this. This time, I took hold of her hand, and I said, "The Lord is our shepherd, we shall not want. He makes us to lie down in green pastures. He leads us beside the still waters. He restores our soul. He leads us in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He restores our soul. Though we walk together through the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil, for you are with us. Your rod and your staff, they comfort us. You prepare a table before us in the presence of our enemies. Our cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow us all the days of our life, and we shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." And there were tears in her eyes and mine as well. Because she had faith now. She could see a relationship with God which was greater than the suffering she was having to undergo in this world. She left this life, but she went home. One more example I'd like to bring up in the 1 minute that I have here, so I'll have to go quickly here, is Jesus. In Hebrews chapter 5, the Hebrew writer talks about, amazingly, that Jesus had to learn something. How could the Son of God have to learn something? It says, talking about his high priesthood in chapter 5 and verse 7 will begin. Who, speaking of Jesus, in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayer and supplication with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things that he suffered. Having become perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Jesus, when he was in heaven, knew that he was going to come down to the earth. He knew that he was going to die upon the cross. He knew that would be a horrible death that he would have to endure. In fact, before that death actually took place, he prayed unto the Father, "If it be your will, let this cup pass from me." He knew what this mountain of suffering was going to be like. And he was so intense, he was sweating, as it were, great drops of blood. Have you ever faced a mountain of suffering so great that you prayed to God so intently that you sweated, as it were, great drops of blood? I never have. Maybe it was because I don't know exactly what's going to happen in those mountains, and Jesus did. But he said, "Not my will, but your will be done." He learned a lesson by experience of what is. You can't learn what it means to really be obedient to God until you have to learn to trust him when times are tough. Yes, the just shall live by faith, trusting God enough to do what he says, no matter what's happening in this physical world around us. The just shall live by faith. It is not an exercise of intellect. It is an exercise of our lives. The just shall live by faith. It is an exhortation, but it is also a criteria of how we determine who it is that is truly just. I have to end with the reading here of the last part of the book of Habakkuk, and then I'll turn the podium back over. Habakkuk chapter 3. After Habakkuk comes to realize what the plan of God is, after he realizes and says how great God is in the creation, he says this in verse 16. Remember how he began. He was questioning God. Why are you doing this? Why aren't you doing something? I don't like what you're doing. When I heard, my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. And he comes up to the people. He will invade them with his troops. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vine, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no fruit, though the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. In the joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength, and He will make my feet like deer's feet. He will make me walk on high heels. Thank you for your time.